Sympathetic dominance, being stuck in fight or flight, finding ways to attempt to activate the vagus nerve in order to transition into a parasympathetic rest and digest state. It's great that people are throwing these terms out there and paying a genuine interest into this topic, but I can't begin to express just how flawed this perspective is when it comes to actually achieving long-term recovery from your chronic condition. It's just too oversimplified for what in reality is a very complex subject. So whilst I believe that sufferers are genuinely on the right approach when it comes to believing that the symptoms they experience are very much linked to one another, I truly believe that investigating the issue on a bit of a deeper level is a hugely important component to actually achieving long-term recovery. You probably don't need me to tell you that there's something off with the way that your body is currently functioning. You intuitively already know that. But what I think that you probably aren't aware of and don't have information of is the precise location of the dysfunction that's actually responsible for creating the myriad of chronic symptoms that you're having to endure. But in order to emphasize the importance of what I'm actually talking about, I think what might be a really beneficial idea is if I present you with some of the findings that were discovered in my own personal case when I had the function of my brain and nervous system thoroughly assessed. Just to give you a bit of a rundown of my own medical history, a decade or so ago, I was diagnosed with inflammatory bowel disease, and then a few years following this, I went on to develop a fairly complex case of dysautonomia, and this included POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. For me, the main symptoms that severely restricted my day-to-day life included the likes of orthostatic intolerance, severe shortness of breath, major gut motility issues, temperature dysregulation problems, sleep issues, and major anxiety and panic. So one very unusual sign that my body was presenting with every single day for over 7 years was that when breathing, my diaphragm couldn't fully expand. So I would start to breathe and my abdomen would start to rise, and then all of a sudden, as it was inflating, it would stop, and then it would force me to breathe out. So I had to take very shallow breaths in and out, and I could never take in a full deep breath. I later found out that part of my brain in the brainstem, called the pons, was hyperactive, and this was very significant to note, as activity in the pons actually interferes with the body's unconscious respiratory rate, and that is a rhythm that is set by part of the brain in the brainstem just below the pons, called the medulla. So because the neuronal activity of my pons wasn't being sufficiently calmed down, what this meant was that my automatic breathing rate sped up, which forced me to breathe much more shallow and prevented me from being able to take in a deep breath. So basically what was happening is that my breathing sped up and there was no way that I could consciously slow it down. So that was one clear sign that the way my nervous system was functioning wasn't promoting health and wellness, and instead severely restricted the day-to-day capabilities of my body. Another variable that was picked up on during the neurological assessment was that my eyes, and particularly my left eye, was exotropic. Both of my eyes were in a neutral position where they had deviated to looking away from my nose. And why this is really interesting to note is that the muscle that actually pulls the eye to looking away from the nose is called the lateral rectus muscle, and the activity of this muscle is actually innervated by the pons. One eye was taking in one image of the world, whilst the other was taking in a completely separate image, and this mismatch of information was actually confusing my brain at an unconscious level. So along with my dysfunctional breathing, this was another outward sign that was being showcased by my body that was revealing clues as to how my brain and nervous system were actually functioning. And these are some significant findings, as alteration to respiration can actually go on to lead to internal changes of chemistry within the body. So this could impact the likes of hemodynamics, so blood flow and blood pressure around the body, digestive capabilities, and just a whole host of other issues. But if you did want to learn much more about all of this, make sure to check out the Unbeatable Blueprint online course. Here I dive a lot deeper into my own recovery, where I share the exact exercises that were given to me and why they had such a profound impact on my overall quality of life. I also share a step-by-step guide for you to adopt so that you too can balance out your own dysregulated nervous system. Right, so I've discussed the fact that I had a dysfunctional unconscious breathing pattern, and also the fact that my eyes were being held in an exotropic position, facing away from my nose. But something else that was discovered during the neurological examination actually involved the activity of my eyes themselves. So during a particular test, the movement of my eyes was being monitored by something called a video oculography, or a VOG. And this was basically a VR-style headset that you'd wear on your head, and it had built-in infrared cameras that were recording the movement of my eyes in response to various stimuli. And one of these situations had a fully blacked out screen with one little white dot sat right in the middle, and literally all I had to do was to keep my eyes fixated on the white dot. And what the test was checking for was to see how well my eyes could actually hold onto a target. And what was revealed to me on the report findings afterwards was that instead of my eyes actually remaining fixated at looking at the white dot, every now and then they would jump from looking at the dot to away from the dot, and then snap right back to looking at the dot. And all of this would happen in such a short space of time. We're talking a matter of milliseconds. It was almost as if my eyes were having a little twitch. And this is a phenomenon called square wave jerks, where the eyes temporarily lose fixation on a visual target and then instantly snap back to looking at that same target. And this whole process happens in under 20 milliseconds, which is clinically very significant to note, because an eye movement that is that rapid can't be consciously executed, which means that certain areas within my brain eliciting certain neuronal activity were actually driving movement of my eyes when ideally they should have been remaining still. And what was causing this to occur was because there was an area of my brain called the basal ganglia, which wasn't sufficiently inhibiting or calming down the hyper-excitable neuronal activity of the brainstem, which is sat just beneath it. And in turn, what that was causing was momentary increases in action potentials, which in turn was evoking the rapid eye movement. Now, this may all seem somewhat trivial to you, and you might be thinking to yourself, why should I bother to pay such an interest in this? And the reason why I think this is so important to observe is because certain specific regions of the brain that execute various eye movements also control and mediate the activity and movements of organs throughout the body. So it isn't just a case of ending up with certain inappropriate eye movements, but it could actually be that that same exact mechanism is causing you to experience inappropriate digestive activity, inappropriate blood vessel constriction and dilation, inappropriate bladder relaxation and contraction, inappropriate hormonal balance, inappropriate immune system function, and of course what I spoke about earlier, alterations in breathing patterns. And if these systems are identified as behaving in a particularly abnormal fashion to what they should be, then that's usually a pretty good indicator that your nervous system isn't quite performing in the most optimal manner possible. And that's why I'm such a big fan of having the function of your brain and nervous system thoroughly examined before jumping to any sort of conclusions and before engaging in any forms of vagus nerve stimulation or any of these other nervous system balancing out activities, because different areas of dysfunction will ultimately result in a different set of chronic symptoms. So you can't just adopt a blanket, one-size-fits-all solution and expect it to work for you. There are just too many separate regions within the brain, right and left-sided structures, cranial nerves, peripheral nerves, and without having any of this thoroughly investigated, there's a very little probability of you being able to actually repair your dysregulated nervous system for the long term. So I just wanted to give you some examples of dysregulated nervous system behavior. Does that mean that if you don't experience any of the symptoms in this video, that your nervous system isn't dysregulated? Absolutely not. It just might mean that the origin of your dysfunction is completely different to what mine was. You might well have a completely different collection of abnormal outputs that are being continuously produced by your brain, and that's why I highly recommend having this whole neuronal system thoroughly investigated. And in my case, this whole assessment was performed by a board-certified chiropractic neurologist, because many of these practitioners are actually trained on being able to pick up on some of these very small and subtle abnormal signs that your brain and nervous system are producing, so that they can diagnose the precise location of the dysfunction and gradually train it back to the way that it was designed to work.